Hello, everyone. Thanks very much for joining us for this webinar on the ACR methodology for emission reductions in rice management systems. This is Nicholas Martin with the American Carbon Registry, and we're very happy to have with us today Robert Parkhurst from the Environmental Defense Fund, Bill Salas of Applied Geosolutions, and Erica Meta-Smith from Terra Global Capital. Paul, advance to the agenda slide, please. So this just gives you a sense of the four presentations you'll hear today. We're going to start with Robert, giving an overview of some of the work that EDF has done over the past several years in laying the groundwork for our rice offset protocol. I am going to try to, following Robert, I'm going to give the basics of the methodology on a fairly high level, just how it works, how it's structured, and so on. We're then going to go to Bill for more detail on how quantification works in the methodology using the DNDC model. And we're going to finish up with Erica talking about some of the work Terra Global Capital has done in reaching out to rice growers in California and the Mid-South U.S. And their approach to data gathering, monitoring, and preparing for verification. We're going to try to do all that in about an hour, leaving a half hour or so for question and answer. Next slide, please. In terms of logistics, I just wanted to tell you a little bit about how to ask questions. You can type questions into your chat box at any time during the webinar, and those will show up for us, and we will direct them to the appropriate presenter in the Q&A period at the end. You should see a chat box near the bottom of your webinar pane, and you can type your question in there. You can also see a hand icon. Should be in the little vertical bar on the left side of your webinar pane. If you click that hand, it will hold your place in line to ask your question directly, to ask your question in person, and we'll unmute you at the end in order to let you do that. I also wanted to mention the webinar is being recorded, and so this presentation, as well as a link to the actual recording, will be sent to all the registered webinar participants and will be posted on the ACR website shortly after the webinar. Next slide, please, Paul. So I'm just going to give a very quick background on ACR. ACR, the American Carbon Registry, was the first voluntary carbon registry in the U.S., founded in 1996. It has been an enterprise of Winrock International since 2007, so a part of the nonprofit organization Winrock. ACR is also nonprofit. We have registered about 37.5 million tons of verified offsets over that period in a broad range of project types. And skipping to recent history, last May we opened an office in Sacramento to support the California Cap and Trade program, and last December we were approved by the Air Resources Board as an offset project registry and early action offset program for the California Cap and Trade market. That means projects developed under the compliance protocols that ARB has approved, as well as projects developed under a certain set of early action protocols approved by the Air Resources Board, can be listed on ACR and go through the listing, verification, and credit issuance process before ultimately converting their credits into ARB offset credits that are eligible for use in the compliance program. Just in terms of average prices in 2012, the average price of all credits transacted and contracted on ACR was $7.40 a ton. That represents only voluntary prices, since there was no transaction volume last year in California compliance tons. Those prices are not represented there and are likely a bit higher. So I am going to hand off now to Robert Parkhurst with Environmental Defense Fund to talk to you about their work in developing a rice offset protocol. Robert?
Thank you, Nick, and thank you for the opportunity to present today. So EDF, our mission is to find ways that work for people and businesses, and we're trying to find, in particular, in the agriculture sector, ways to get farmers and ranchers paid for environmental practices. Our work on a rice protocol goes back starting in about 2007, and I'll go through some of that pretty quickly here today. What I'd like to start with is a little bit of background and history here. Paul, yeah, thank you. So the EDF started our work with what's known as a Conservation Innovation Grant from USDA and NRCS, the Natural Resource Conservation Service. And what the SIG grants are intended to do is to stimulate development and adoption of innovative conservation practices. And it's part of what's called the EQIP program, the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, which is a part of the Farm Bill. EDF has received 2 SIGs, as they're called, for our work. And in 2011, this is the most recent one, there were 9 of these grants focused on greenhouse gas mitigation. So what's the goal of the SIG? So the main thing for us, this specific one, is to demonstrate methane emission reductions from rice production in the U.S. and creating credits for that. And so we wanted to field test practices, produce an offset protocol, determine where it could be used throughout the United States, and create the first credits. One of the things that's important about credits from rice production is that they're non-reversible. It is from created from the destruction of methane, and so unlike protocols like the forestry protocol, once it's destroyed, it's completely gone. And we are trying to develop this to access environmental markets, primarily in California, where there's over 200 million metric ton potential between 2013 and 2020. One of the things that's really important about our work as an environmental organization is we want to make sure we think about the trade-offs there are out there. And so with a lot of the rice fields, and as you can see in the pictures here on the right, there's a lot of water birds that congregate in rice fields, particularly during the winter months. And so part of our grant and our research that we focused on what the impacts were to waterfowl and make sure that our protocol doesn't have any negative impacts to these habitats. So this is a quick timeline of where we were, and where we are with that. As you can see at the top, we've got 2 of our 2 grants there. And the first one here, we really focused on the calibration and validation of the biogeochemical model, denitrification decomposition, which Bill will talk about with you guys shortly. And this model uses a whole bunch of data around soil, climate, and other factors to estimate the GHG emission reductions. In addition to that, we focused on economic modeling, and that worked. That spanned both our first and our second grant that we worked on. We were really looking at what the costs are to do these practices and finding different ways to what the impacts were for those different costs. So if you did them, how much could you save? How much did it cost you? Was there any impact on yield? Switching from our first SIG to our second SIG, we expanded from going from California to include the Mid-South, and Nick will tell you specifically what states we focused on there, and the further development of 2 modules to 1 protocol, 1 for California and 1 for the Mid-South, and that is actually open for public comment right now. And then we're also demonstrating the generation of the first credits, and Erica will tell you about the work that she's doing with us on that. And then finally, we're looking at ways to facilitate the collection and the reporting of that data. And that's some of this, a product called the middle layer, which again, Erica will talk about. Finally, we expect the ARB to adopt this protocol towards the end of this year into early next year, and that will pave the way for the generation of the first compliance credits that can be generated in vintage 2014. This next picture is just a demonstration of what goes into an offset project based on the people on the phone. I think most of you know this. But really, first you've got to figure out what's eligible, what practices qualify. After that, you collect the data about a project on planting, harvest, management, yield, and all of that is used to go through these models to generate the emissions reductions. Once you know what your emission reductions are, then you can go through what I call the paperwork phase of this, is generating all of the documentation and paperwork to go through the voluntary or regulatory system to generate the credits. And then you implement the project. Most of that is putting the project through the review process of the registry body or the regulatory body. Then you get the offsets, and then you can sell them. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to people that are far more knowledgeable than I am on the details of the protocol, the model, and the actual generating of credits. Nick, back to you.
Great. Thanks so much, Robert. That was useful. So I'm going to spend the next 15 minutes or so trying to give you the basics of the methodology, covering everything but the quantification aspects that Bill will talk about. So let me just start with the sort of basic structure. This is a modular methodology, meaning it has a parent methodology that was approved in May 2013 by ACR, and then it has modules for different rice growing regions, eventually, potentially all around the world. So the parent methodology provides what you see there: definitions, eligibility criteria, project boundary that apply to all the modules, all rice growing regions. It provides ways to set the baseline and establish additionality of the project activity. It lays out the quantification using the DNDC model and the uncertainty associated with DNDC, how that's deducted so that the crediting remains conservative. And then it includes calibration and validation of DNDC and some rules on verification to provide flexibility. So that was approved in May 2013. Also approved in May 2013 was a module for the rice growing region in California. And then the first additional module is for the Mid-South US, several states, which is actually right now out for public comment. And I have at the bottom of the screen a link for you where you can see the full parent methodology and California module, but you can also download the Mid-South module and comment on that for us, and we'd really encourage you to do so. Any stakeholders who are interested, give us comments on the Mid-South module. We'd really appreciate that. So this methodology is being piloted with rice growers in California and the Mid-South US under the Greenhouse Gas Conservation Innovation Grant, the second grant that Robert talked about. The eligible practices in the methodology are listed here. So in California, you have those three practices: straw removal after harvest, switch to dry seeding, and early drainage at the end of the growing season. And I think, you know, maybe a way to think of it is, what we're talking about here is any practice that reduces the amount of time that fields are flooded, that have those fields in anaerobic conditions where the anaerobic bacteria are producing methane, and or reduces the amount of organic material available for anaerobic decomposition. So straw removal does the latter. Switch to dry seeding and early drainage, those two practices cut the flooded period a little shorter, both at the beginning and then at the end of the growing season. In the Mid-South US, that module includes similar eligible practices plus a few more. So again, straw removal after harvest, again, early drainage. In the Mid-South, there's been a lot of interest in intermittent flooding throughout the growing season, which is sort of illustrated in that graph you see. Multiple cycles through the growing season of flooding the field and draining it back down to stop the anaerobic conditions that produce methane. That is best combined with a single nitrogen application at the start of the season and an overall reduction in N rate and nitrogen applied. And then finally, a whole set of practices under the umbrella of increased water or energy use efficiency. Those are all things that basically improve the efficiency of water use and thus reduce diesel used to pump water and the CO2 emissions that come from combustion of diesel. So there's a lot of interest for reasons besides greenhouse gas reductions in the Mid-South in improving water use efficiency. And all of these things, by changing the grading of fields, poly piping systems, which you see in the photo there, all of these things allow farmers to improve the efficiency of their water use, leading to less diesel used. Then there's other things that maybe don't change the water use, but more directly affect diesel emissions, like switching to more efficient diesel pumps and switching to electric pumps. Sorry. These rice growing regions are identified in the parent methodology, and they function in two ways. One is these are the regions over which the DNDC model is calibrated and validated. And the second way is these are the regions in which current adoption rates of practices are assessed to determine whether practices at very low rates of adoption, whether a practice is at very low rates of adoption and can use the standardized baseline and additionality procedures that I'll talk about in a second. You also see on the slide there a chart of rice acres planted in 2012, showing you that Arkansas is the leading state, followed by California, and then smaller acreages in 4 other states. Project boundary is established in the methodology basically by defining rice fields and requiring a minimum of 5 rice fields or 1,000 acres be included in the project. That is for reasons of reducing structural uncertainty in the model, as well as realistically in view of the fact that any rice project is likely to include probably a lot more acres than that and multiple farmers in order to improve, sort of reduce transaction costs. A concern of farmers on their data privacy, that the exact locations of fields have to be provided to the registry and the validation verification body, but can remain confidential. The methodology provides for programmatic aggregated projects, meaning a project is already aggregated in the sense that it's got multiple fields and probably multiple farmers, but it can also be programmatic in the sense that once a project is established and you set the crediting period for that project, additional fields can be added over time. And fields can also drop out, because in years when rice is not grown, for example in places where rice is grown in rotation with other crops, there's no crediting, there's only crediting in the years that rice is grown. In terms of the greenhouse gas sources, the main greenhouse gases are carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide in soil, and those are compared in the baseline and project scenario. Some other greenhouse gases do have to be accounted from burning of straw in the baseline, and in the project scenario from alternative uses of straw if that gets removed and used in, biofuels, building materials, animal feed, etc., as well as greenhouse gases from production and transport of fertilizer that may have to be added to replace nutrients from straw. The crediting period is 5 growing seasons, with credits only awarded in the years that rice is grown, and it applies to the project overall, not specific fields. I talked about baseline and additionality, and the approach to that is a little different in this methodology. For practices that are adopted on less than 5% of the rice acres in a rice growing region, those projects can use a common practice baseline, meaning that the baseline parameters are set based on typical practice rather than the practice on the last sort of few years of historic practice on the fields in the project itself. And additionality for those types of projects, as long as they demonstrate that the activity is not required by regulations, those practices are deemed additional without any requirement to demonstrate barriers. However, we want to incentivize changes also of practices that are maybe adopted by a few growers but not the majority. So from practices from 5% up to 50% adoption, they use a baseline that's field specific, that's based on management over the last 5 years on their own fields, and they have to show, and to establish additionality, they have to show that the project activity passes those 3 tests of exceeding regulatory requirements, going beyond common practice, and facing higher implementation barriers than the prior management. How are adoption rates determined? There's 2 ways: a statistically valid survey of randomly selected fields in the rice growing region, that's a survey conducted by the project proponent, or expert opinion, experts who are credentialed and whose credentials have to be provided by the project proponent, providing their assertion that adoption is less than 4%. The only reason for the difference there is to ensure a little bit of a buffer. So we really want to know that adoption is less than 5%, but we're going to be sure of that by requiring the expert assessment that it's less than 4%. Part of the reason for these different approaches for baselines and additionality is the issue of early adopters. So this has been a really important issue in a lot of agricultural methodologies and an issue for farmer participation. In some protocols, even if practices are not required by regulation and they're at low adoption rate, so they might be deemed additional, but if the baseline is set just based on the last, say, 5 years on a farmer's own fields, then their baseline is going to be the same as their project in the case of an early adopter of that practice, and they'll get no credit. And that is potentially problematic from the perspective that rewarding and incentivizing early adopters is often believed to be the best way to increase adoption by others. So the industry leaders that have adopted a practice should not be disqualified from crediting, because if they can't be credited, it's unlikely that others will adopt that practice. And also you have to realize that at least for some agricultural practices, these decisions are sort of year to year. So if you don't allow some mechanism like this, there's the potential at least for a perverse incentive that would motivate early adopters to discontinue the practice only to restart it and claim credits. So the way we've dealt with that in this methodology, and it's pretty new to this methodology, although ACR is trying to apply it in some of our other agricultural methodologies as well now, is to say that an uncommon practice, that is a practice implemented on less than 5% of the rice acres in a rice growing region, is deemed additional, first of all, and secondly, it uses a common practice baseline. So the parameters for the baseline are set not by that producer's recent management, but by typical management on at least 5 non-project fields based on a survey again. With one other limitation, however, that because the point of this early adopters mechanism is to incentivize adoption by others, if it's not working, if 10 years later adoption remains below 5%, we surmise that there's other barriers and that the early adopters mechanism is not being effective to increase adoption, and therefore those early adopters are not allowed to renew their crediting period. So if it's not increasing adoption, at most 2 crediting periods are allowed. Quantification is in DNDC, a process-based model. I'm not going to talk about this very much because Bill is going to talk about it in detail. And it's run for the baseline and the project, as you see here, and Bill will talk more about the inputs and outputs from the model, so I'll skip over this. I want to talk a little bit about leakage. Leakage, the hypothesis for this methodology is the type of practices that we're talking about will have negligible impacts on yields. But if there is a significant impact on yields, that has to be derived based on the actual yields for the growing season. So the way the methodology does that is to compare yields to historic yields at least 3 out of the 5 years before the project start. And then because yields can be affected, of course, by weather and other seasonal variations that are unrelated to the project activity, we use a normalization procedure normalizing against county-level yield data to distinguish between seasonal variations and decreases in yield that are actually induced by the project activity. If there are those sorts of yield deductions, then there's an equation to calculate emissions from leakage based on the emissions intensity and own price elasticity, and that leads to a leakage deduction that has to be subtracted from the net emission reductions credited to the project. I want to say just a little bit about verification. Verification is somewhat unique for agricultural protocols, and we've wanted to sort of think carefully in this methodology about how to make verification the most rigorous as well as the most cost-effective. That doesn't necessarily mean sending a verifier to visit every participating field. So what we have written into the methodology is a completeness audit in which all fields will undergo a desk review by the verification body, and then an in-depth audit in which the verifier will select for each year verified the greater of 20% of the participating fields or 2 fields, whichever is higher, and conduct and select those fields based on a random or a risk-based sample. And those are the fields that undergo an in-depth audit. It's selection with replacement, so that if a farmer has been selected for a visit, they can't then assume they're not going to be visited again in a later year. And the idea of this in-depth audit is to assess, did the project activity actually occur, and are the critical management parameters used in the project consistent with the expected range that's specified in the methodology. As another flexibility mechanism, the methodology allows the use of industry experts in place of the verification body for the field visit, provided the verification body has selected the fields and they're unknown to the grower until after the practice is implemented, usually after the growing season. And there's always a requirement to consult farmer records but triangulate with other sources. So some of those sources that we have identified in the methodology, for some things that need to be verified, it might be much more effective to use remote sensing or other methods to assess that. So things like the eligibility of the field, the implementation of dry seeding. For example, did the green signal from vegetation appear before the water signal, verifying from remote sensing that dry seeding indeed occurred. The flood update, the drain date, these things can sometimes be seen pretty well from remote sensing. And so that's a powerful tool, and even raises the possibility of verifying certain parameters on 100% of fields instead of just a sample. We've also been looking at in-field sensors and probes for water and soil moisture to establish when fields were flooded or drained. There's a lot of agricultural data that's collected through precision agricultural equipment. There's potential usefulness of date stamp photos that could be taken by the farmer and uploaded to a secure account that the verification body can access. And other techniques you see there. The main theme, though, of this is what data sources can be useful to the farmer for real-time management information that's useful to him or her for actually managing their operation, but also provides a saved record of practices that can be used by the verification body. And so a lot of those sources are highlighted in the methodology. The final thing I want to talk about is aggregation and programs of activities. So as I mentioned, in these projects you'll have multiple farmers, multiple fields, in fact a minimum of 5 fields on 1,000 acres, but likely far more. And that's treated as an aggregate with random or risk-based sampling of fields for verification purposes. That's really important to reduce, because verification is often the highest sort of cost item in the project development process, to be able to verify a whole aggregate. In ACR, the crediting then would be to the aggregate, and the aggregate grader would hold the account on the registry and distribute revenues among growers. Aggregation is also important for purposes of structural uncertainty. The more fields and the more hectares or acres are included in the project, the lower the structural uncertainty in the model, which Bill will talk about. And that means that as more and more fields come in, you will have hopefully a lower structural uncertainty deduction for all participating fields. For that reason, what we've done is, instead of putting the structural uncertainty deduction right in the methodology, we've separated it out, put it on the ACR website, and aggregation, and so structural uncertainty is then addressed at the program level, meaning as more projects get registered, ACR can update those structural uncertainty deduction factors more frequently than we might update the methodology itself, and projects can always use the latest version of those uncertainty deductions. And finally, programs of activities, I mentioned this already. Once a project is established, the aggregator can add or remove fields during the crediting period with the proviso that credits are only issued if the minimum number of fields or acres are in the project at the time of verification. If they're not, of course, the aggregator can postpone issuance and add fields to get back up to those targets. So I'm going to hand off now to Bill Salas with Applied Geosolutions, who will talk about some of the mechanics of DNDC.
Thank you, Nick, and thank you for inviting me to give a discussion on the role of DNDC in the ACR methodology. I'm going to give a general overview of the DNDC model and why it's being used for the RICE methodology. I will then give a brief overview on how we parameterize the model for each individual field in a project, how we go about calibrating the model according to the methodology, and then lastly and importantly, how we have done some research to quantify the uncertainty in using the model for quantifying changes in emissions and how the protocol, how the methodology itself accounts for those uncertainties. So DNDC was initially developed in the early 1990s with an initial focus actually in estimating nitrous oxide emissions that required that the model look at sort of the mechanisms or the processes that drive carbon and nitrogen cycling in agro-ecosystem soils. It's been used for a large number of crops to date. It does a full accounting of field-level greenhouse gas emissions, accounting for all the soil sources and sinks of emissions, including carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. For the model to work well, it's key that the model can capture the growth of the individual crops we're trying to simulate and the yields. So that's part of the calibration phase, as part of the ACR methodology. But it's important to note that DNDC is a mechanistic or a process model, and we'll get into that as we discuss it. So the basic approach of the model, and this is sort of a detailed wiring diagram that I won't really delve into, but I just want to say that the model simulates how the microbial environment and microbes change in the soil based on weather and climate drivers, soil conditions, whatever crop you're growing, and how you manage that cropping system in terms of tillage, irrigation, fertilizer practices, etc. And then from that detailed series of processes or mechanisms, the model then estimates net fluxes of carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, and methane. Why do we need DNDC for this RICE protocol, and why do we need a mechanistic model? Well, methane is a key greenhouse gas emission from the systems, and it's quite complicated. So when the soils are flooded for rice production, you simultaneously have the production and consumption of methane. You have methanogenesis, which produces methane, and you have methanotrophy, which is oxidation of methane. Now, there are multiple sources of pathways for emissions of methane from the soil environment to the atmosphere, because that's really what we're trying to model, is the net flux of methane from the rice paddies to the atmosphere. So the first and largest source is transfer of methane from the flooded soil through the plants themselves. That was that first dynamics that I showed. The second source is what we call ebullition, which are bubbles that come up through the flooded profile in a flooded rice paddy to release methane into the atmosphere. And then the third main source is when you actually drain the field, some of the methane that's in the soil profile is released and outgassed to the atmosphere during that drain event. So the process model needs to be able to capture not only the production and consumption of methane, but also all the transport processes that drive the net emissions from a flooded rice field. And DNDC models all three of these pathways. And so it's a good process model for looking at methane and greenhouse gas emissions from rice production systems. So now that we have this model, so there was a brief overview of the model, the first step is we need to parameterize the model. By that, I mean we need to provide all the inputs that the model requires to simulate emissions from a particular field. Those inputs include your agricultural management practices, your soil conditions, and daily weather drivers that are affecting it. Management information includes when you plant the rice, when you harvest it, what type of tillage systems you're using, when you till, fertilizer type, how much you apply, when you apply it, how you flood the fields, and how you drain it, etc. So those are all sort of the parameterization process for agricultural management, and the methodology goes into some details on how to do that, and we provide some template systems for showing how to put those input parameters into DNDC. In addition, we need data on soils. Soils are an important environmental driver for greenhouse gas emissions, and at a minimum, the model requires 4 pieces of soil information: soil clay fraction or clay content, soil organic carbon content, bulk density, and pH. Fortunately, these parameters are available in soil surveys, but also are frequently measured at the field level, and we'll discuss the implications of using the soil surveys versus field measured data momentarily. In addition, the model requires daily weather data, and so typically we use local weather stations that are close or nearby the rice fields to extract daily weather data on temperature, precipitation, radiation, and wind speed. So these data are relatively available, and there's some discussion of potential sources in the methodology depending on your region. Once we've pulled together all of the crop input parameters that and soil and weather input parameters that DNDC requires for the methodology, the next step is to test the crop calibration to make sure that the model is simulating rice growth and yield properly. So there's a several-step process that's outlined in the methodology, where we first select default calibration coefficients for each region. You perform model simulations, so you collect the model parameters to run your simulations for the previous 5 years. You then do a direct comparison of the DNDC-based estimates of yields with your measured yields for each field, and then you look at the residuals between the two, and if the root mean square error between your observed yields and modeled yields are less than 10% of the mean observed yields, then that's deemed to be sufficient calibration. If not, you then need to go in and adjust 3 potential crop parameters that are part of the crop elaboration for DNDC. The first is the maximum biomass parameter, and that's adjusted based on if your modeled yields tend to overestimate field yields, you reduce the maximum biomass parameter. If the converse is true, where the model is underestimating yields, you increase the maximum biomass parameter. There's also some parameters on transpiration efficiency and thermal degree days to maturity that you can adjust, and it's described in a little bit more detail in the protocol, and probably beyond the scope of this webinar to get into detail. But basically, you need to calibrate and verify that the model is working well for the particular fields in the project. Now, once we've done the calibration, and we then actually use the model for simultaneously modeling both the baseline and project emissions. So we use the model to do both, with full accounting of changes in soil organic carbon, net CO2 fluxes, methane, and nitrous oxide. So for each individual field in your project, you need to do a separate set of model simulations, executing both your synthetic baseline, which is what you would have done in the absence of the project, and your project scenarios based on the appropriate parameterization of the model. So for each individual field, we do simulations for both baseline and project. In addition, the methodology requires that we, quote, spin up the model, so to speak, where we do a simulation of the 20 previous years by repeating the previous 5 years that were used for the crop calibration phase over a 20-year period. The reason we do this is the model requires some estimates of not only the total amount of soil organic carbon in the soils, but the relative pools of the soil carbon as far as their how they decompose. And so by doing a 20-year spin-up, we can initialize those pools based on the model simulations. So that's why we have a 20-year spin-up period. Then we move into the crediting phase. So the first year of the crediting period, you'll do a 21-year simulation. And then you'll calculate the emission reductions for that first year period, for that year 21, so to speak. A key aspect, so we've got this model. It's got the processes and mechanisms for estimating emissions. We do the parameterization. We do the initial calibration. But we know that models are not perfect, as well as we sometimes do not have all of the input data that we would like to do the parameterization. So that introduces uncertainty in our estimates of greenhouse gas emission reductions. So there's two main sources that we talk about in the methodology. One is model structural uncertainty. The other is uncertainty due to input data errors. The distinction is important. Model structural uncertainty is really sort of related to the inherent formulation of the model. And it's defined based on where we have all of the inputs that the model requires, and we compare it, model estimates of emissions, to field-based estimates of emissions, assuming that the field-based estimates of emissions have no errors associated with them. Input uncertainty is more an issue of tracking unknowns in inputs through the modeling process to see its effect on modeled emission changes from baseline to project. So to calculate the model structural uncertainty, what we've done is we've done detailed model validation of the DNDC model using independent field data. And based on the measured versus model, we calculate what we refer to as residual, which is the difference of measured emissions from modeled emissions on a field-by-field basis and management system basis. And then we do some statistics on the model residuals to understand structural uncertainty. So here's an example of 71 data sets that we've done independent model validation for DNDC. The different colors represent different states. As you see, there's a fairly good correspondence in general between the magnitudes of measured emissions and modeled emissions, but there's some clear scatter from the one-to-one line. So if you put the one-to-one line, and then for any given point, you can calculate the residual, which is the difference between measured and modeled, that we then do the statistics upon to estimate model structural uncertainty. Another aspect of this figure that's important to note is, sometimes the model overestimates emissions, sometimes it underestimates emissions, and that's why the aggregation process to multiple fields begins to reduce the structural uncertainty. Okay, so how do we actually calculate the deduction values for structural uncertainty? We do a statistical analysis of the residuals, which is the values of the measured versus modeled for all those points that I just showed in the scatter plot. Once we've done that, we do some statistical tests on those residuals and come up with a methodology for accounting for that uncertainty in the protocol. So in general, this is the formula that's provided in the protocol itself, and the structural uncertainty is a function of both your confidence interval that's required. So for ACR, it's a 90% confidence interval, and hence the value for the t-statistics, but also the size of your project area and number of fields in your project. As you get to larger and larger projects, or in the program rather, larger and larger number of fields in area, the N value increases, and hereby reducing the structural uncertainty. So from this formula, we can create lookup tables. Here's a lookup table for two of the regions as an illustration on our structural uncertainty. So if you look at this table, the middle column is for the Mississippi River Delta region, and if you have a program size of only 405 hectares, you have to reduce your emission reductions by close to 36 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per hectare per year. But as you aggregate to larger areas, that deduction factor decreases. Again, for the Louisiana Gulf Coast region, we have slightly larger deduction factors. Again, those deduction factors decrease with a larger area. So each of the ACR modules will have an associated table with it that the project developers will use for accounting for model structural uncertainty. And the next step is to account for input uncertainty. We do that through a series of Monte Carlo simulations. It's important to note that soil is an important driver for greenhouse gas emissions from rice production systems. So in the soil surveys, they give you a range of values. You don't really know the exact value if you're going to use the NRCS soil surveys. So we account for that uncertainty by doing a Monte Carlo set of simulations based on that range of expected values. So for any given field in the project, you calculate area-weighted soil estimates with a estimate of uncertainty based on the probability density functions that are provided in the methodology. And based on that, we then do, at least 1,000 Monte Carlo simulations of the model for both the baseline and the project. And from those simulations, we now have a distribution of emission reductions by implementing a project. And this is done by using the batch function in DNDC, and it's described in the methodology. So I won't delve into it right here, but basically you create a batch input file, you run your several thousand simulations, and from that you can look at the statistics. And here's an example for one field where we looked at the impacts of input uncertainty on modeled emission reductions. And so now we have 1,000 or 2,000 different values here, and this is a histogram of those values. The protocol then says to calculate input uncertainty for that particular field, you have to then pick the 10% quantile from that distribution. So in this case, 10% of the values are on the left of the red arrow here, 90% are to the right. And so to be conservative at the 90% confidence interval, we say you have to reduce your emission reductions by 1.5% due to uncertainty in the inputs in this case. So then we have to actually combine the inputs. So we have two sources, as I said, the structural uncertainty, which relates to model, and the input uncertainty. Following ACR requirements, if the total project uncertainty is less than 10% of the reduction, then you don't have to apply a deduction. If it's larger than that, then you must apply the deduction minus the 10%. So we then do that at the project level. So we have, on a field-by-field basis, the estimate of uncertainty due to inputs. Then we have the program estimate, which is the structural estimate of uncertainty based on total area or total number of fields in the program. And that's how we do the calculation of uncertainties. So that was a fast run-through of sort of some very detailed technical details of the DNDC work. I'm happy to talk about it in more detail with people, but for the sake of time with a 1-hour webinar, I can't go into much more detail at this point. But at this time, I guess I'll turn it over to Erica to talk about the data gathering, monitoring, and verification component of the methodology.
Thanks, Bill. So I'm going to go ahead and talk about our experiences in California. Though there are practices starting in the Mid-South, I'm actually looking at only those project actions in California, which is baling, the straw removal, dry seeding, and early drain for California. So there are those data requirements for the methodology that we just talked about, which the methodology is a huge document, but I'm looking at ways that we can get the information from the methodology, get the parameters from the methodology to the farmers, and that would be the management data, the amounts, the dates, what practices are being carried out in the field, as well as information on soils that Bill just talked about. And there's other data that can be preloaded into the model. I'm also going to go over field monitoring and new tools for monitoring. So the data that's gathered every year from the farmers, as well as a new tool that we've created to help with that interface and streamline data collection and monitoring. Also, I want to talk about what farmers are worried about and going over with verification and field audits. What the field auditors need from the farmers, as well as what the farmers need to present at verification. So for what I'm doing in California is I am going talking with farmers to make sure that they can fulfill the requirements in the methodology. This is a series of phone calls, emails, farm visits, meetings with UC Extension. This is all gathered on a per field basis. So maybe a farmer may have 5 fields or 20 fields, and it's quite a long process to sit down with the farmer and go over each field for each set of data. There's generally 3 pools of data gathered. There's a general field data, which is more of the location, which is sitting with the farmer and finding out where their actual field is, which is a lot of back and forth of going over maps, old maps, new maps, and then maybe seeing them like a file or a Google Earth file of where we think that location is, and they can give us a yay or nay. And then from that location we can know soil type and all the general soil data that we need for the model input. The second pool of data is information after project start, or current data. And that's all the dates, amounts, practices, yields, management regime, flooding schedule, etc. And these are easily known by the producer. The data is usually easily gathered or known off the top of their head. They have notes from this year's practices. So I can sit with the farmer after the harvest or during the harvest and talk about practices that have been used, and then when everything is at the end of the harvest or at the end of the season, I can make sure that we can verify that everything was carried out, and that's pretty much easily gathered. What's more difficult is historical information, the third pool of data. It requires 3 years of past management practices. So maybe yield, maybe field 104 was tilled 3 times in 2010, twice in 2011. It gets the further you go back in time, the more difficult that data is to find. We often work with a lot of family farmers, so the data is passed down from generation. Sometimes there's very poor record keeping, so we have difficulty of finding the history of that field. And some fields are just ineligible due to lack of data. We've had farmers come in with great ideas. They want to bring in all their fields, but we find out that they actually only bought their fields 2 years ago. We don't have that historical information, so those fields are ineligible. So what we've decided to do is to make a mid-layer, which is a tool to streamline the data collection. It's a user-friendly tool to streamline project development, monitoring, and verification. So it's a client-side graphical interface used mainly for farmers, also aggregators and verifiers. It simplifies this process of data entry. It has safe data storage, and it can be easily accessed by all parties. It has built-in quality assurance and quality control, so erroneous data that is put into the system is easily flagged, and it can be stored for future corrections. This is a great way to streamline the verification process, as data information is accessed, can be accessed by a third party. The third party can see when the data was entered, when it was corrected, and who entered the data. The actual mid-layer is designed for an aggregation or collectives. So usually we're doing with multiple farmers, multiple fields, and there's quite a difficulty of organizing all that data on a per field basis. If you have multiple farmers, multiple fields, you can have one aggregator to organize all of this. It presents the data in understandable formats that can be either shown by date or farmer's records. So often a farmer will come to us with their data in books by year, and we need to see the data as a per field basis. So from the model, when the data goes into the model or goes into the mid-layer tool, we can print out it in a year basis, so they can easily look at the data and match that to their records. I'm just going to give a little example here of the mid-layer interface. So in that first column, we have the farmers. So there's going to be 3 people looking at that data, which will be the farmer, the aggregator, and the verifier. The farmer is the field owner, the owner of the carbon offset in most cases. The aggregator is someone like myself who's working with multiple farmers who can help gather the data and enter the data in the system. The system is ideally used by the farmer, but if necessary, an aggregator can come in and help enter the data. What you're looking at right now is actually the aggregator interface, so the farmers would not see other farmers' names there in that first column. Under first you have the farmers, and second you have the fields. So what we're looking at here in that first row is the information for one field. So first, the farmer would enter the location of their field, so we can get some basic data from the location of their field to put into the model. Then they would put in data in the feasibility analysis, and that would be kind of kicking the tires to see if this is actually a project that is right for them. They would put in the data that they do know, and they could run the model at this point and see if it's something that they would actually be interested in. If it looks like it would be a desirable thing to do, they could put in the historic information, and that is once again on a per field basis, so they can see they can easily import data from other fields to kind of remove repetition of adding data. For example, maybe field 204 and field 15 are always tilled at the same time because they're next to each other, and it's easier for the equipment to move back and forth. From this data, they can actually get a kind of a quick results. It actually imports data or downloads data from the DNDC model, and from this information, they can get quick results of if it's actually feasible for them to go ahead and carry out these practices. This really empowers the farmer to be able to make the management decisions they need to capitalize on the market, or decide to potentially do a different crop. So what we're doing in California is Terra is acting as an aggregator. We are creating a project plan that contributes different fields on behalf of the farmers. So we are acting as a farmer collective. What we're doing is streamlining the data exchange. We're producing a project document. So if the methodology is kind of a cookbook of how to measure carbon, the project document is the cake. That's what it's given to the verifier, and the actual showing the emission reductions. We're managing the validation and verification process, creating the farmer agreements, and working with farmers to make sure that they're comfortable with what they're agreeing to. We also are facilitating the marketing of credits. We have a lot of experience in the finance world, so we can help get those potentially high-paying buyers. Some of the benefits of the aggregation is that small farms can participate. Most of our farmers that are enrolled in the project would not be able to participate on their own because they do not have enough acres. Some other benefits are that the risk is distributed and uncertainty is reduced, and the costs are decreased without actually sacrificing the integrity of the project. And so a lot of our farmers were concerned about monitoring. It's kind of a bigger issue for a lot of them, especially verification, having an auditor come out to their fields. Once again, fields may leave the project temporarily or permanently. So working on those farmer agreements, we want to make sure that the farmer is comfortable with what they're agreeing to. If there's an incentive to move that field out of rice production to, say, capitalize on a market in tomatoes because that's more beneficent to that year, then the farmer can go ahead and do that. Also, we're monitoring potential reduction in yields. So if the yield decreases, we have to actually account for that, and that's market leakage. A big concern is the audits. So locations are given only to the verifier and are, of course, recorded by the aggregator and the standard. And the aggregator, the actual verification body, may only visit 20% or two fields. Likely it'll be about 20% of the fields. Certain aspects of the field audits may be replaced by industry experts or remote sensing when appropriate. We talked about that a little bit about, say, the phenology of the rice production. Say if it is dry seeding, we can see that, could potentially see that on remote sensing. And timing, of course, is critical to specific parameters or specific project actions that are taking place. For example, if they are doing early drainage, the auditor may need to come out exactly at that time for early drainage. A lot of farmers were concerned about what the auditor is looking for, what they're actually going to be inspecting on their land. Once again, the purpose of the field audit is just to see whether the project activities actually occurred. They're not looking at other things that are going on, and also whether the critical parameters are within an expected or verified amount. We've gone over, we're actually right in the middle of the process of running the models with the farmers, and so far we have a pretty high participation rate, and everyone that we've worked with was okay with monitoring and verification so far. We're looking forward to moving ahead through verification with farmers very soon. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Erica, and thanks to all the speakers. So we want to go into a Q&A period now. We have about 23, 24 minutes for that. And I have some questions that have been submitted already. Before I go into those, I just want to remind folks there's you'll see a little hand that you can click to raise your hand if you'd like to ask your question of us directly, or if you prefer, type your question into the chat box and that will come through to me and I'll direct it to the appropriate speaker. So I'm going to go right into a few of these questions. First of all, there was a brief question, can some of these systems be used in other parts of the U.S.? And I'm not quite sure if I'm interpreting this correctly, but in terms of the methodology, it can be used right now only in the specified rice growing regions that are for which there's a module that's written, and that is the California rice growing region, Sacramento and San Joaquin Valley rice growing region, and within the Mid-South, what we call the Mississippi River Delta, which is the eastern Arkansas, western Mississippi, and small parts of Missouri and Louisiana that are in that rice growing region, and then the Louisiana Gulf Coast, which is a separate rice growing region, quite different practices down in southwest Louisiana. We hope to be able to add the Texas Gulf Coast as well to the Mid-South module, but that right now is, once the Mid-South module is approved, that is the geographic extent of the methodology. Now, I'm not aware of other parts of the U.S. that are major rice growing regions, but if there were, those would have to have their own module. And then, of course, around the world, there are many very strong rice growing regions for which we're considering potential modules in the future. A number of questions are going to be for Bill that concern the quantification. And Bill, let me give you one of those now. Was there enough data to validate DNDC and calculate separate uncertainty deductions for the Mississippi River Delta and the Louisiana Gulf Coast separately, or were those combined and an uncertainty deduction calculated for both of them together?
We have more field data for the Louisiana Gulf Coast than we do for the Arkansas, Mississippi Delta region. However, we did have just enough field data for Arkansas to do a separate calculation of model uncertainty. And we're expecting additional data over the next 6 months that will strengthen that uncertainty calculation for the Arkansas, Mississippi Delta region. So we did do separate validations and structural uncertainty quantification for the two regions.
Great. And just a related question while you're on that topic. How were the measured values measured for comparison with the model estimates? Were that chambers, eddy covariance? What were the measured values? Where did that data come from?
Yes, so the data came from a series of sources, including published data in peer-reviewed literature, collaborations with field scientists that are collecting the data now, that are in the process of publishing some of the data, and all of the data that we use for the estimate of field-based estimates are based on chamber measurements. So that the field scientists go out, they use flux chambers to estimate emissions on a daily basis, and then we try to impute seasonal emissions based on the daily data to compare with the modeled emissions from DNDC. So all of the studies used flux chambers. The majority of the studies have already been published in peer-reviewed publications. Some of the more recent data is in the process of being published and going through the peer review process. In the end, we will only include those data sets that have been peer-reviewed in the final quantification of uncertainty over time.
Great, thanks. And I'll give you one more, Bill, before giving you a rest. Does the methodology allow for collection of site-specific soil data for input into DNDC? And if so, is there any advantage to that?
Yes, and I glanced over this a little bit too quickly in my presentation. The methodology does allow people to either use field-measured estimates of the soil parameters, and then based on those field measurements, there's guidance on how to do the Monte Carlo simulations to calculate the input uncertainty. But presumably, the field measurements will give you a better quantification of the soil parameters that DNDC requires, and hence will lead to a smaller reduction due to input uncertainties than if you were to use the NRCS soil surveys. That said, soil parameters have a big effect on the magnitude of emissions, but the uncertainty in soil parameters will simultaneously affect both the baseline and the project quantification. So if you looked at that histogram, you saw that the input uncertainty deductions were only a few percent. Which is a result of the fact that it affects both the baseline and project in fairly similar fashion. And that's why, in the end, the input uncertainty is not a large deduction from to be conservative for the methodology.
Great, thanks, Bill. Here's a question, Robert. I think I'll give you this one. On average, how many tons of CO2 reductions can be expected on a per acre basis, or what range on a per acre basis? We've talked a lot about that, but I know, EDF, you've done some specific analysis of that. Can you speak to that, Robert?
Sure, absolutely. So the range of reductions is anywhere from a third of a ton to one, or you may be able to get to 1.5 if everything goes your way. But really, what we typically say is about a third of a ton to a ton per acre.
Okay, depending on practices and so on, and
yeah, depending on practices.
And can just an addition, can some of the practices be combined to increase that number?
Yeah. So if you did, in California there are 3 practices. There's early drainage, dry seeding, and baling. And if you combine those together, you can increase the amount of reductions you get. And then similarly, in the Mid-South, the more practices you do, the more reductions you get on a per acre basis. And I don't have right at my hand the different combinations and permutations of that. It really does vary not only with practices but also with the soil type, because soil type is a very big driver in how many reductions that you get. So you can get, if you have a soil type, a clay or a clay type soil type, you can get more reductions per acre than you could, say, if you had a sandy loam.
Great, thanks, Robert. Erica, here's one for you. Will the middle layer tool that you spoke about be publicly available for aggregators to use? And two-part question, will this tool have an interface to the DNDC model?
So to answer the second part of the question, yes, it will actually be using the DNDC model and importing data from there. And secondly, I do not think so. I think this is actually a model for us as an aggregator, but I can follow up with the person that sent that if they're curious.
Great. While you're speaking, Erica, and based on your experience working with these farmers, about how much time does it take for a farmer to gather all of the historical information, and then how much time would it take them to gather the annual monitoring data?
That's a great question. So for most farmers, it's been about an hour and a half to gather all of the historical information, but that's probably over maybe 3 phone calls and a few emails. I guess they could be spending more time finding that data, but that's more the time that I've spent going over the information with them. That's usually for about 3 to 5 fields. We do have farmers that have in the 20 range of fields, and that is going to take them a lot longer. And I don't quite have an answer of how long it is. Just depends on the farmer and how good the record keeping is. Some are great record keepers, and some are not. And some have just handed down their farm from their parents, and they're just taking it over, and they're not even sure what data they have available, or if any. For the current information, it may take about 15 minutes, depending on how well how much they know about their fields. Often I can sit with a farmer and they can go over those current practices within a matter of minutes. Maybe I shouldn't say 15, maybe about half an hour for those current practices, because it's only that year, and it should be right off the top of their head and or easily accessible written down somewhere.
Okay, and just to clarify, while you're talking about the tool, Erica, does the tool pull data that the farmers have entered into DNDC, or the other way around, the farmers enter data into their tool and it then gets exported to DNDC?
I'm actually not sure. The tool has not been completed yet. I believe it actually takes some, maybe, I'm actually not sure about that. I can get back to that same person as well. It's not finalized yet, but there is data coming from the DNDC model, as well as we are collecting the data as well. So I have to figure out what I can get back to that person if they want to give me their contact information.
So in a sense, there's a bit of a two-way flow where your tool is collecting, either the farmers are inputting or you're getting from the farmers and you're inputting management data, which then DNDC uses. So in that sense, the flow is from the tool to DNDC, but there's also information that going directly into DNDC, I think is what you're saying.
I'm pretty sure that's how it works, and I'm sorry I don't have more information on that. It's still in the process of working out the kinks, but I believe most of the information can go from us and then be sent to the DNDC model, and then the information will come back into the DNDC model and be presented to the farmer.
Okay. Switching gears a little bit, is an agronomist required to be part of the verification team, similar to the requirement in the Climate Action Reserve's Nitrogen Management Project Protocol? I'll take this one. There's not a specific requirement of that. there is in the methodology the option for the verifier to use someone like an agronomist, cooperative extension expert, etc., and to have that sort of person on their team, and have them do the site visit and so on, verifiers who are verifying this kind of project are going to have specific accreditation that may be easier to achieve if they have that kind of person on their team, as a subcontractor on their team, for example. But it's not an explicit requirement, and I should highlight that for a farmer, that they shouldn't be looking to the verifier for agronomic recommendations. What the verifier is really doing is confirming that a practice occurred, and that, for example, fields were flooded and drained on certain dates and so on, not getting recommendations on what they should do on their fields. That's a very important thing to emphasize. Here's another sort of higher level question on costs and volumes. Robert, I might let you have a crack at this, and then I might be able to speak to it as well. What are the costs per ton that have been incurred to bring a credit to market? If this is not yet known, what are the estimated costs, including verification cost, soil sampling, if soil sampling is being done, etc., the different components of costs?
We are doing an economic study of that right now, and should have the results of that later this year. So I don't have anything to say right now, but we're in the process of doing the cost to implement these practices and the cost of verification right now.
Okay. Let me add to that just in a qualitative sense. EDF is doing that analysis. We'll come out with some specific numbers. But if you just want to think about components of cost, certainly the aggregator has a cost to do all their outreach to the farmers and run the model, prepare offset project documents. All of that is part of the aggregator's cost. There will be a verification cost, which I think is the most significant component, and that will not be proportional to the size of the project. I mean, there might be some increase in verification cost for a larger project that includes more farmers and fields, but probably not at all proportional to not a one-to-one increase at all. So that's the key transaction cost savings in verification, that if you've got a project with 10 farmers and 2,000 acres, it might not cost that much more to verify a project with 100 farmers and 10,000 acres. So, so that's an important point about verification cost. There's, in terms of project registration, there's a registry cost. If this project is being ultimately registered on ACR or another of the voluntary registries, or in the future, brought to the California market and registered on one of the ARB offset project registries, there are comparatively smaller costs to that, which are, sort of relatively small costs to review offset project documentation. That for ACR is a sort of a one-time $750 cost, and then there's costs per ton to transact credits, which are also low. For ACR, those costs are 17 to 18 cents per ton, and they're not charged on issuance, but only on when the project is ready to transact. So the registry costs shouldn't be ignored, but they're relatively smaller. And I think those are the main costs to keep in mind. I realize that's only a qualitative answer, but in case that's useful. And I think that's the end of the questions I have here. I hope I haven't missed any. if there are any last questions that folks want to either raise their hand or type in, feel free. But I think I've asked all the questions that have been typed in. I guess I just wanted to once more thank all the presenters as well as everyone for attending this webinar. I also reiterate that if there are aspects that you didn't get as they went by, the PowerPoint as well as a recording of the webinar will be sent out to everyone and will be posted on the ACR website as well. If that's all the questions we have, I think that brings